Mehdi Hasan, poster boy for the modern Red-Green Alliance, and one of the reasons Piers Morgan's show is so unbearable to watch. He has exploded in popularity, partly because the Islamic population in numerous Western English-speaking countries has also grown significantly in the past decade. With that growth has come a louder voice, one increasingly comfortable demanding recognition and reframing the West through an Islamic lens. Historical revisionism, in fact. How did this happen? Well, Matt Walsh put out a tweet responding to a video featuring Mr. Hasan, which I'll get to in a second, where he says, "Christianity built this country. Islam did not at all in even the slightest way. That's why we can have our church bells, you ungrateful little," and so on. In response, Mehdi put out a rather interesting tweet. 1 in 3 of the slaves who built this country were Muslims. They were here long before the Walsh family arrived. You would know that if you had studied history, but I know MAGA has an issue with studying. Oh, and I'm guessing you don't count slaves as people or Americans. Ah yes, how grateful he is, this new American. So, Mehdi Hasan claims that 1 in 3 of the slaves who built America were Muslims. It sounds profound, until you realize it's pure historical fiction. Most credible historians estimate that only 10 to 15% of enslaved Africans brought to North America were Muslim, and even that figure is generous. Many came from regions where Islam had spread unevenly, and within a generation, most had converted to Christianity or abandoned Islam entirely. To inflate that number to 1/3 is not truth-telling. It's stolen valor through historical revisionism. It's a way of inserting Islam into the American story where it never belonged, to rewrite the moral architecture of the nation itself. In fact, the reality is that America was not built by Muslims, but by free men and women under a Christian moral framework. The founders themselves were steeped in biblical imagery and Enlightenment reasoning, a combination that gave America both liberty and law. George Washington once said, "It is impossible to rightly govern a nation without God and the Bible." John Adams called the Constitution made only for moral and religious people. That moral base wasn't Islamic. It was unmistakably Christian in worldview and Western in its philosophy of freedom. Now, before we get to the next part, if you enjoyed this video so far, please remember to give the video a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and consider signing up on Patreon, which comes with a ton of perks. Slavery, as horrific as it was, did not define that moral foundation. Overcoming it did. America's defining struggle was to end slavery, not justify it. And it didn't find that moral courage in the Quran, but in the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal." Those words would become the ideological dagger that eventually killed slavery, a concept alien to the theocratic worldview of Islam, where equality exists only among believers. And ironically, the young United States would fight its first war as a nation to end slavery, not within its borders, but against it. The Barbary Wars were fought after Muslim states in North Africa began capturing and enslaving American sailors, demanding ransom and tribute in exchange for their freedom. It was that very conflict that led to the creation of the US Navy, forged to put an end to Islamic piracy and slave-taking. In other words, America's earliest fight as a sovereign power was literally against those who sought to enslave its people under the banner of Islam. The very system Mehdi defends has a far darker legacy when it comes to slavery. For over 1,000 years before the Atlantic trade, Muslim empires enslaved millions of Africans, men, women, and children, in brutal trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trades. Unlike in America, most never saw freedom, and their descendants vanished into history. You can watch more about Islam's history of colonization and slavery in this video on my channel below. Mehdi's revision isn't harmless. It's an attempt to graft Islam onto a civilization that grew precisely because it rejected that kind of rule. America's soul was carved out of rebellion against dogma, the same dogma he now wants to pretend was part of its birth. The same dogma that the media and institutions are now trying to sell to you as some sort of peaceful ideology, completely compatible with Western democracy. But if you disagree, they accuse you with buzzwords, and many are clamping down opposing voices with legislation. That's exactly why I use Proton VPN and why I think you should too. They're based in Switzerland, outside the reach of US, EU, UK, and Australian law. They don't keep logs and are built by the same team behind Proton Mail. When the UK passed its surveillance laws, Proton VPN became the #1 app on the App Store. Their stealth protocol beats censorship firewalls. Secure Core routes your traffic through privacy-first countries, and NetShield blocks trackers before they ever reach you. I've used Proton Mail since Australia announced sweeping surveillance laws last year, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it's now essential. If you want to protect your privacy and support this channel, hit the link below to get up to 60% off Proton VPN. Look, all of this did come out of nowhere. It was a result of a clip that's blown up online.
I think that if you can play church bells, you can pray the call to prayer. We are as American as anyone else, and don't take any BS from anyone.
Now, it's a good line, if you're completely clueless on American history, that is. Beneath that soundbite is a complete misunderstanding of what freedom of religion actually meant to the people who founded the United States. When Jefferson, Madison, and the rest of the founders debated religious liberty, they weren't talking about Islam. They weren't even thinking about it. It's laughable anybody could think otherwise. The conversation was about sects of Christianity. Protestants, Catholics, Quakers, groups who shared the same broad moral universe but differed on doctrine. Jefferson's famous line, "It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg," wasn't written to defend a theocracy. It was a plea to limit religious coercion. The idea was simple: your faith is your business, so long as it doesn't infringe on anyone else's freedom. That concept was revolutionary. It emerged out of centuries of European conflict, Catholics burning Protestants, Protestants persecuting Catholics, and the founders wanted a clean break. They weren't handing a blank check to every ideology on earth. They were creating a nation where reason and faith could coexist under secular law. Islam, by contrast, has never drawn that line. There is no separation of mosque and state in Islamic history because Islam doesn't recognize such a distinction. Mehdi is not asking for equality, he is implying equivalence. But church bells aren't political declarations. The Islamic call to prayer is 5 times a day, by the way. It's a literal call to submission, to the supremacy of Allah, to the exclusivity of Islam. But we also need to call out the glaring hypocrisy here. The same ideology demanding its voice be heard in Western cities silences every other faith in its own heartlands. In Saudi Arabia, it's illegal to build a church or wear a cross in public. In Pakistan, a single accusation of blasphemy can get you lynched. In Iran, converts to Christianity are imprisoned or executed. Even in so-called moderate states, non-Muslims are second-class citizens. Islam doesn't believe in freedom of religion. It believes in freedom for Islam. When it's weak, it asks for tolerance. When it's strong, it ends it. Maybe we live in a world today where saying so is politically incorrect, but to do so is ignoring almost the entirety of Islamic doctrine and its own history. That's why I don't buy into this notion that all religions automatically deserve equal footing in a liberal democracy. I'm genuinely tired of pretending this is the case. I was born in a state where there was no such freedom for religions outside of Islam, and trust me, that is what the endgame always looks like when Islam takes over. Freedom of religion was meant to protect belief from power, not to hand power to belief systems that crush dissent once they have it. There's a line between practicing your faith and trying to reshape society in its image. And that brings us to the part that really puts Mehdi Hasan's words into perspective. So Mehdi declares that Muslims are as American as anybody else. But becoming an American is more than a feeling or a document. It's a pledge. Every naturalized citizen takes the oath of allegiance, swearing loyalty to the United States, its Constitution, and, if called upon, to defend it. The oath includes the promise to bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by law. Now, there are exemptions to this. People can request to omit that clause if they have religious or deeply held moral objections to bearing arms or performing military service. But according to posts circulating online, good old Mehdi may just have taken advantage of that exemption when he became a US citizen. Not surprising, is it? If your faith instructs you to refuse a civic duty that every other citizen swears to uphold, I think it is then fair to ask where your ultimate loyalty lies. The oath is more than paperwork. It's a moral contract, a declaration that you belong fully to the country you've chosen. When you edit that promise, even legally, you're admitting that something else comes first. In Mehdi's case, that something else has made itself known time and again. In resurfaced clips, he's described non-believers as animals, cattle, and people who live their lives like beasts. More recently, He drew outrage after posting a tweet so grotesque he had to delete it hours later. It doesn't matter if it was meant as a joke. Mocking the deaths of fellow Americans is probably about as un-American as it gets. See, you can't demand freedom under a flag you won't fully swear to defend. That contradiction between the rights Mehdi enjoys and the values he undermines says more about this "we're as American as anybody else" act than any of his tweets ever could. At its core, this is about an ideology that refuses to coexist on equal terms. America's founders believed in one law for all, a secular covenant that placed conscience above creed. Mehdi's worldview, like so many Islamist ones, believes in one law, God's for all, and those two visions can't ever truly live side by side.
In the neon haze of a broken dawn, steel towers hum, but the wild runs on.